So straight out of the blocks, let me ask you this question. Do you have anything in your past that you wish you could go back and erase? I'm not talking about necessarily stuff that would have involved a line up at the local police station, but just something that you could, like, if you could scrub that, have a do-over, you'd probably choose that. Like the tattoo with the name of the now ex-girlfriend, the haircut that all the cool kids were getting, and you look back and you wonder, what was I thinking? The business opportunity that seemed too good to be true, and you jumped in and you discovered that it was, in fact, too good to be true. For me, one example is my first car choice. It looked very much like this. This is a Holden Kingswood HQ model. Now, it looks like a decent sort of car, and actually, I'm not bagging the car, but for me, I bought this car when I was 18 years old, studying full-time at university and working part-time delivering pizzas. And so this car is like a 6-cylinder car. It was a giant, and it took a lot to run. And nobody who's studying at full-time university should be driving a car that costs a lot to run. If I could go back, yes, I would in fact choose a different model vehicle. So listen, we're talking about a series that we launched a few weeks ago called Set Free, and it really plays to this big idea that God wants his kids to both be set free and then to learn how to live in that freedom. And what we're doing is we're just taking a few slices out of Paul's, what are collectively known as his prison letters. So Paul was a leader in the early church. He wrote a bunch of letters to churches that he'd either launched or he'd developed some sort of mentoring relationship with. And a number of those letters he wrote from various prisons during his lifetime. So look, week one, we talked about what it means to be set free from shame, that God wants us to be set free from the penalty of our past and ultimately learn to live free from the patterns of our past. Week two, we talked about being set free for a purpose, this idea that you were saved from something and saved for something. And then last week, we talked about the idea that we're set free to rejoice, that each one of us can experience supernatural joy, just like Paul did, even when we're facing circumstances that are challenging and less than ideal. So what I want to talk about today is about being set free from your past. And you're going to learn that this topic very much overlaps with the topic that we launched this series with, being set free from shame. When we talked about shame, we talked about some of the causes that might lead to people walking in shame, things like something you said or did, some destructive patterns of behavior that you're not proud of, maybe that you grew up in a challenging environment and you sort of had this idea that you felt shame even though you might not have been responsible for that environment. And we even highlighted the idea that some Jesus followers walk around feeling shame because they kind of have this idea of the standard that God wants them to live up to, and yet are vividly aware that in some areas of life they're falling woefully short. Well, let me talk about our past today. Again, they overlap, and some of the things in our past that I want to talk about being set free from are things like small thinking, comparison, fear, insecurity, anxiety, inadequacy, people-pleasing, depression. Some of the things that keep us limited. And they can be things in that list that we've kind of learned to live with, but that doesn't mean that they're God's best for our lives. And the problem with these sorts of things is as long as we're chained to them or tethered to them, they will actually prevent us from moving forward to becoming the person that God wants us to become and living in the freedom that God wants his kids to live in. So let's talk about that today. If you've got your smartphone camera, you can scan this flow code. It's going to take us to another of Paul's prison letters. So we've looked at something from his letter to the church in Ephesus. We've looked at something from his letter to the church in Philippi. Now this is a church in a place called Colossae. And Paul, he hadn't actually ever been to that church. He hadn't met the people there personally, but he'd heard things about them. And a lot of what he heard was good. And he wrote to them to encourage them with the good things. But he also came to learn that they were really struggling with this tension of some of their old life before they placed their faith in Jesus, and then the new life that Jesus ultimately made it possible for them to live in. Like sort of struggling to leave old mindsets and behaviors behind in order to embrace the new and the better. So this is something that Paul wrote to them. Since you've been raised to new life with Christ, set your sights on the realities of heaven where Christ sits in the place of honor at God's right hand. Think about the things of heaven, not the things of earth. For you died to this life, and your real life is hidden with Christ in God. Paul's reminding them that their faith isn't simply about believing something new, it's actually about stepping into living something new. He's telling them to stop looking backwards, to stop looking just at the things of this earth, to start looking forward, to start letting the things of heaven become your priority. Now, Paul was uniquely qualified to write this sort of instruction because that was exactly Paul's experience. Prior to becoming this entrepreneurial apostolic church leader, Paul was a Jewish religious leader and actually had a very clear role to persecute Christians, to persecute churches, to effectively eliminate the threat that the Jewish faith, the Jewish religious leaders, should I say, saw the Christians becoming. And that was Paul. That was his background. That was his life. But then he had a very real and very radical encounter with Jesus. And emerging from his encounter with Jesus, Paul's life literally turned around 180 degrees. He went from persecuting the church to personally launching churches and making his life mission all about seeing the Church of Jesus Christ grow. So Paul, when he talked about letting go of your old life, that person is dead. The ways that person thought, they're dead. The things that person did, they're dead. God wants to kill them off and then to raise not just you to new life, but actually for you to experience this new life. So, look, that's the very important reality. Just because we are raised to new life doesn't mean we automatically start thinking like the new person. Doesn't mean we automatically start acting like the same person. We have to actually learn some new ways of thinking, some new mindsets. We have to see some shifts take place that will translate into our behavior and the way we live every single day. So I want to just talk from Paul's letter a few pro tips that he highlights of how we can make this transition. That yes, spiritually, the old person is dead, the new person is alive. Now in the actual outworking of that, how do we get to that place? How do we live, think, act, behave like the new person that God's created us to be? Well, the first one, and I'm just going to use a couple of metaphors. This one's going to go retro. The first one is stop replaying the tape. Now, I get it. If you're under 30, you definitely won't have a clue what I'm talking about. If you're under 40, it might be a bit fuzzy, but let me just ask for an honest answer right now. Is anybody willing to acknowledge that you recognize this, and not just recognize this, it's incidentally a radio cassette player, but you once owned one, you knew how to work it, you knew all its special features and functions. Yeah, you know who I'm talking about. You're probably over 40, like me. Sure, I get it. And what I want you young people to know is that this idea of playlists, Spotify playlists and Apple Music playlists, the idea of making playlists is not a new thing. In fact, those of us who owned a radio cassette player, we knew how to make a playlist. You would get a cassette tape, you would insert that cassette tape in the radio cassette player, you would have the radio on, you would then push the play, record, and pause button, and you would sit attentively next to that machine waiting for your favorite song to come on. You would unclick the pause button and you would record that straight from the radio. In the song, you'd push pause and then you'd wait again for another one of your favorite songs to come on. And you would just record a song, followed by another song, followed by another song. Before you knew it, you had an entire cassette tape made up of the bangers, made up of your greatest hits. You called this a mixtape. Yes, that's right. It wasn't something invented by rappers. No, we called them mixtapes back in the 70s and the 80s. And then when you had that mixed tape, you would take that everywhere you went. If you went in the car, you'd take that mixtape. If you visited a friend's house, you'd take that mixtape. If you were extravagantly wealthy, you might own a Sony Walkman and you'd be out in the wild and you would have your mixtape with you. And you would play that and rewind that and play that and rewind that and replay it and rewind it and replay it and rewind it. And it just went on and on. The problem is that the more you rewinded and replayed that tape, the more the tape would physically deteriorate. It was a physical thing. It was an analog technology. Now, eventually, you had to throw it away. But that wasn't a bad thing, because at this point in time, there was new songs, new mixtapes, new things to experience, so you could do it all over again with a brand new tape. Here's what I want to highlight today. While these songs were typically our greatest hits, the stuff that we rewind and replay up here too often is not our greatest hits. It's actually too often our greatest regrets, our greatest disappointments, our greatest fears. And I want to encourage us to stop rewinding and replaying the tape. Maybe that's your decision today. Throw the old tape away. Paul, I'm going to read it again. Since you've been raised to new life with Christ, set your sights on the realities of heaven. Stop replaying the things that you learned on earth before you put your faith in Jesus. Think about the things of heaven, not the things of this earth. Stop replaying the tape. Now, if that's a bit obscure, tape, cassette, I still don't get it. Okay, fine. Let me talk about a metaphor that I think we all understand. Throw away your old clothes. Like, have you ever had an item of clothing that you just couldn't bring yourself to part with? Yeah, me too. There was a time when I had a pair of shorts. Now, they were, well, depends on your choice of words, beige, cream, bone, off-white, ivory. That was the sort of color. And I wore them everywhere. I wore them at home. I wore them traveling. I wore them I think I even wore them preaching a few times, incidentally. These things were so much a part of me that my wife and some of our friends nicknamed them the Short, because they kind of assumed that I only owned one pair of shorts, simply because every time I showed up, I was wearing the Short. And And I wore them for very good reasons. Now, of course, I wore them because I was frugal. I'm like, these shorts are perfectly good. Why would I throw them away? But I also wore them because they were very familiar and they were very comfortable. But eventually, they were beyond their best date, beyond their use-by date. And even then, I didn't throw them out until I did. And I want to put it to you today that too many people make this exact same mistake with their old ways of thinking. That they hang on to their old ways of thinking because they're familiar, despite the fact that those ways of thinking may very well have passed their use-by date. And I want to encourage you, just like you'd should throw away old clothes, throw away old ways of thinking. Stop reaching for them just because they are comfortable and familiar. Now, Paul then goes on a list of thinking and acting that's like old ways. It's a pretty good list. Let me read it to you. Sexual immorality, like he says, in fact, he says this, since you've been raised to new life, put to death the following: sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, greed, anger, malicious behavior, slander, dirty language, lying. Friends, this was 2,000 years ago, but that list, you could just as easily write that now and it would be just as applicable now because the human condition hasn't changed. But Paul says, put them to death. Get rid of them. Throw them away. They don't hold up anymore. In fact, they don't, it's not just that they don't hold up, they hold you back from experiencing the new life that Jesus has made possible. Like, we can't walk in the new if we're still hanging on to the old. So here's my question. Whether you need to stop replaying the tape, whether you need to throw out the old clothes, whether you need to put to death some old ways of thinking and old ways of behaving, let me just ask this question. Is there one thing that springs to mind? Don't come up with a list of 10, because I think you'll kind of get tangled up in knots. But is there one thing, one old way of thinking or one old way of acting that you know right now, as you're listening to this, as you're reading from Paul's instruction, that you need to put it to death? Because Paul then goes on to write, put on your new nature. You've thrown away the old, you've put it to death. Put on the new nature. You know, this idea that to live and experience the new that God's got for us isn't just about what we say no to, it's also about what we say yes to. It's not just about what we throw off and put to death, it's about what we put on and allow to grow and to flourish in our lives. And look, it will likely feel a little unfamiliar at first. It won't feel as comfortable as the short. You might need to kind of grow into it. It might take some getting used to, some time to wear in. But if it's better, then that process is very, very, very much worth it. And I've seen it. I've seen people put off the old, put to death the old, put on the new. I've seen people break free from addiction and then do the work day in and day out to start to live in the new life that Jesus has made possible for them. I've seen people who have made the decision to stop running from God and to place their faith in Jesus, and then over time learn to trust Him more and more with every aspect of their lives. I've seen people who have carried around anger and unforgiveness and bitterness for years, sometimes decades. I've seen them make the decision to embrace forgiveness, which isn't easy, and then to start living and learning what it means to live free and set free from that chain of bitterness and unforgiveness. And that could be you today. Why not? Think about it, pray about it, and make sure you show up again next week, because we're going to continue to look at what it means to both be set free and ultimately learn to live free.